Before Olivia Bennet walked out of her Wall Street office for the very last time, she had everything most people spend a lifetime chasing. A six-figure salary, a corner office, and a career others envied. Yet at 36, she felt completely empty. So she did something that made no financial sense. She resigned without another job waiting, packed everything she still owned into her SUV, and drove nearly 500 miles to a small coastal town in Maine, where she spent $350 on an abandoned boat workshop that everyone else considered nothing more than a collapsing pile of rotten timber. The auctioneer laughed as he handed her the keys. The locals shook their heads, whispering that the woman from Wall Street had lost her mind. Why would anyone walk away from millions in potential earnings just to buy a forgotten boat shop that hadn't built a single vessel in decades? Olivia couldn't answer that question herself. She only knew she couldn't go back to the life she had left behind. 3 weeks later, while removing an old workbench bolted to the workshop floor, her pry bar struck something solid beneath the wood. Hidden below was a narrow compartment that appeared on no building plans. Inside rested a weathered wooden tube wrapped in oilcloth, sealed so carefully it had survived decades of damp sea air. When Olivia carefully slid out the first rolled parchment, she found elegant hand-drawn boat plans bearing 2 faded words stamped across the corner: Master Builder. In that instant, she realized someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide these blueprints from the world. But who had created them? Why were they buried beneath an abandoned workshop? And what secret had remained hidden for generations? That's where our story begins. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now, if you're starting your morning. I hope today brings you peace and unexpected blessings. If you're winding down after a long day, thank you for spending part of your evening here with me. Leave a comment below and join the conversation. I read as many of them as I can. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and life-changing discoveries, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next journey. Olivia Bennet stood alone in the mirrored elevator descending from the 42nd floor of the investment firm where she had spent the last 13 years of her life. The polished steel reflected a woman wearing an expensive charcoal suit, flawless makeup, and a company badge that would stop working within the hour. Every promotion, every bonus, every late night had brought her closer to the career she had once dreamed about. Yet as the elevator quietly dropped toward the lobby, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt proud of what she actually did. That morning had begun like countless others on Wall Street, with market reports, conference calls, and discussions about acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The numbers had been impressive, the conversations had been efficient, but somewhere between another presentation and another projection of future profits, Olivia had looked around the conference room and noticed something unsettling. Everyone was talking about value, yet no one was talking about people. She suddenly understood that she had become exceptionally good at calculating the worth of companies, while quietly forgetting how to measure the worth of her own life. She returned to her office, opened a blank document, and typed a resignation letter that filled less than half a page. Her manager tried to persuade her to reconsider, reminding her of the promotion that was expected within the year. Another colleague joked that everyone fantasized about quitting, but no one actually did it. Olivia smiled politely, thanked them for the opportunities, packed the framed photograph of her parents, a coffee mug she had barely used, and a small cardboard box of personal belongings, then walked out of the building without looking back. By late afternoon, the Manhattan skyline disappeared in her rearview mirror as she drove north along the interstate. She had no new job waiting, no long-term plan, and no certainty beyond one simple fact: she could not return to the life she had just left. During the next week, she wandered through coastal towns in Maine, stopping wherever a weathered harbor or quiet street caught her attention. She rented inexpensive motel rooms, ate simple meals, and spent evenings searching public auction listings for forgotten properties. Most were far beyond what she could afford or required more money than she still possessed. Then one listing stood out among dozens of abandoned garages and storage sheds. Former boat workshop, county tax auction. Minimum bid, $350. There was only one faded photograph. It showed a long wooden building leaning slightly toward the harbor, its paint weathered by salt air and years of neglect. One side of the roof had partially collapsed, and broken windows faced a quiet inlet where only a few fishing boats remained. The building looked completely forgotten. Strangely, Olivia couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 days later, she attended the county auction held inside a modest town hall. Most bidders were local contractors interested in vacant land or commercial lots. Conversations paused briefly when an unfamiliar woman in business clothes entered, carrying a bidder's card. The boat workshop appeared near the end of the sale. The auctioneer glanced around the room. $350 to open? Olivia slowly lifted her card. Silence followed. A man in work boots laughed softly. Another bidder leaned toward his friend and whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Someone from away is buying that old boat shop." No one offered another bid. The auctioneer shrugged, brought down the gavel, and announced the sale. As Olivia signed the paperwork, several people smiled with the amused expression usually reserved for someone making an expensive mistake. An older man passing by shook his head. "That place hasn't built a decent boat in longer than I can remember." Olivia thanked him anyway. She wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She simply felt drawn toward something she couldn't yet explain. The following afternoon, she followed a narrow coastal road lined with weather-beaten houses until the harbor finally came into view. The abandoned boat workshop stood near the water exactly as it had in the auction photograph. Tall grass surrounded its weathered foundation, and gulls circled above the faded roof. A rusted wooden sign still hung above the wide entrance, though most of the lettering had disappeared beneath peeling paint. She unlocked the heavy front door using the old brass key included with the sale. The hinges groaned loudly before the door slowly swung inward. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that slipped between broken roof boards. The scent of aged pine, salt water, and old varnish lingered in the still air. Wooden workbenches stretched across the main floor, surrounded by hand tools left behind decades earlier. Large timber beams crossed the ceiling high above, while wooden boat frames rested unfinished along one wall. Frozen in time as though the craftsman had simply stepped outside and never returned. Olivia walked slowly through the silent workshop, running her fingertips across scarred benches marked by thousands of careful cuts. Every corner carried signs of patient craftsmanship. Unlike the polished offices she had left behind, this building had been shaped by human hands rather than quarterly reports. As the afternoon light began fading, she explored a small office built into one corner of the workshop. An old desk leaned against the wall beside rusted filing cabinets. Beneath a threadbare rug, she noticed a square outline cut into the wooden floor. Pulling the rug aside revealed a small trapdoor fitted with an iron ring. She tugged gently. It refused to move. Kneeling closer, she brushed years of dust from the edges and discovered an old lock built directly into the wood. She stood quietly, listening to the building settle around her as waves rolled softly against the nearby docks. Then, from somewhere beneath the sealed trapdoor, came a faint sound. It was only a single, dull tap, but it echoed clearly through the silent office floor, leaving Olivia staring at the locked door beneath her feet. The sound beneath the trapdoor lingered in Olivia Bennett's thoughts long after she stepped away from it. She knelt once more, pressing her ear against the weathered wooden floor, but the workshop had fallen silent again. Only the distant cry of gulls and the gentle movement of waves against the harbor reached her through the old building. She tested the iron ring a second time, pulling harder, but the lock refused to give way. Whatever lay beneath had remained undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. With daylight fading and no tools strong enough to force the hatch without damaging it, she reluctantly locked the workshop and drove into town, deciding that whatever mystery waited below could survive one more night. The next morning arrived with cold sea air drifting across the harbor. Olivia returned carrying cleaning supplies, heavy gloves, trash bags, and a notebook filled with practical tasks. Before worrying about hidden compartments, she needed to make the workshop safe enough to work inside. Broken glass covered sections of the floor. Rainwater had leaked through damaged shingles, leaving dark stains across several beams. Cobwebs stretched between old workbenches, and decades of dust coated nearly every surface. She spent hours sweeping debris, opening windows to let fresh air inside, and sorting through piles of rusted hardware that had been abandoned where craftsmen had once left them. Despite the neglect, she noticed something surprising. The building itself had been exceptionally well constructed. Massive timber posts remained straight. The floor barely creaked beneath her weight. Every beam fit together with remarkable precision. Whoever had built the workshop had cared deeply about lasting craftsmanship. Near midday, a pickup truck rolled slowly into the gravel lot. A tall man climbed out, carrying a toolbox. He looked to be in his mid-40s. With weathered hands and the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent most of his life working with wood, he removed his cap before approaching the open doorway. "Morning," he said with an easy smile. "You must be the woman who bought the old boat shop." Olivia smiled back. "I guess word travels fast." "Small town." He extended his hand. "Jack Sullivan." "Olivia Bennett." Jack glanced around the dusty interior before looking up at the damaged roof. "You've got your work cut out for you." "I've started to notice." He laughed softly. "Mind if I take a look around?" Olivia nodded. Jack walked carefully through the workshop, occasionally running his hand across old beams or stopping to examine joints where heavy timbers met. Unlike the people at the auction, he wasn't laughing. He seemed genuinely interested. After several minutes, he pointed toward the damaged corner of the roof. "That section needs attention before the next storm. Lose much more water, and you'll start ruining the interior." Olivia sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Good news is, whoever built this place knew exactly what they were doing." "I've worked on newer buildings in worse shape than this one." She hesitated before asking, "Would you be willing to help?" Jack considered the question only briefly. "Sure. I'll charge fair rates, and if you're willing to do some of the labor yourself, we'll save you quite a bit." They spent the rest of the afternoon replacing damaged boards, securing loose shingles, and clearing blocked gutters. Olivia quickly realized how little she knew about practical construction. Jack patiently explained each task, never making her feel foolish when she asked simple questions. By sunset, the worst leaks had been temporarily sealed. Looking up at the repaired roof, Olivia felt a small but genuine sense of accomplishment that she hadn't experienced in years behind a desk. Before leaving, Jack paused near the small office. "Ever hear who owned this place?" Olivia shook her head, only that it stopped operating a long time ago. "You should talk to Eleanor Pierce over at the library. If anyone remembers this workshop, it'll be her." The following morning, Olivia found the town's small public library overlooking the harbor. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman carefully shelving returned books. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and reading glasses rested low on her nose. When Olivia introduced herself and mentioned the old boat workshop, the woman's expression changed immediately. "So someone finally bought it," she said quietly. "I'm Eleanor Pierce." They settled into two wooden chairs near a window overlooking the water. Eleanor folded her hands for a moment before speaking. "When I was a little girl, people still talked about Elijah Rowe." "Who was he?" Olivia asked. "The finest boat builder this town ever produced." Eleanor smiled faintly, as though recalling someone she had known all her life despite meeting him only as a child. His boats were famous for being beautiful, but more importantly, dependable. Fishermen trusted them with their lives. "Did he own the workshop?" Eleanor nodded. "For many years." She looked toward the harbor beyond the library window. Then one day the workshop closed. New factories were producing boats faster and cheaper. Little by little, people stopped talking about Elijah. Eventually, the building was forgotten. Olivia listened carefully. "Did he have family?" Eleanor slowly shook her head. "Not that I remember. Most of what I know comes from old stories. History has a way of fading when no one writes it down." Those words stayed with Olivia as she thanked Eleanor and returned to the workshop that afternoon. The building no longer felt like an abandoned structure. It felt like the last remaining piece of someone's life's work. Before continuing her cleaning, she walked into the small office and looked once again at the locked trapdoor beneath the faded rug, remembering the tools Jack had left behind. She searched until she found an old pry bar, sturdy enough to remove the rusted lock without splitting the surrounding wood. The task took patience. Rust resisted every movement. Finally, after several careful attempts, the weakened lock snapped free. Olivia wrapped both hands around the iron ring and slowly lifted. The heavy trapdoor groaned open, releasing a rush of cool, stale air from below. A narrow, wooden staircase disappeared into darkness. She found a flashlight in her toolbox and descended carefully, each step creaking beneath her boots. The small basement was dry despite its age. Stone walls surrounded shelves coated in dust. Old barrels rested against one side, long emptied of their contents. In the far corner stood a cedar chest reinforced with black iron straps. Unlike everything else in the room, it showed almost no sign of water damage. Olivia brushed away decades of dust before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of yellowed canvas, lay a large, rolled parchment tied with faded blue ribbon. Her pulse quickened as she gently untied the knot and unrolled the first sheet across the chest's lid. Drawn in dark ink was the elegant design of a wooden vessel unlike any she had ever seen. In the lower right corner, beneath a beautifully scripted signature, two bold, stamped words immediately caught her eye. Master Builder. Olivia Bennett remained in the basement long after the afternoon light had begun fading outside, resting the rolled parchment carefully across the cedar chest. She studied every line of the remarkable drawing before her. Although she knew almost nothing about building boats, she immediately recognized the extraordinary precision of the work. Every plank, rib, beam, and joint had been measured with meticulous care. Tiny handwritten notes filled the margins in elegant script, explaining why certain curves were shaped a particular way, or how different types of wood should be chosen for specific sections of the hull. It was far more than a simple blueprint. It felt like a master craftsman quietly teaching someone he would never meet. In the lower corner, beneath the bold stamp reading Master Builder, another name appeared in graceful handwriting: Elijah Rowe. Olivia traced the signature lightly with her finger without touching the ink itself. She remembered Eleanor's words at the library only hours earlier. The finest boat builder this town ever produced. Standing inside Elijah's forgotten workshop while holding one of his original plans made the elderly librarian's memories suddenly feel very real. She carefully carried the blueprint upstairs and cleared a section of the old office desk. Sunlight from the dusty window illuminated the parchment as she examined the handwritten notes more closely. Elijah had written not only measurements, but brief observations beside many parts of the design. Strength should never outweigh balance. Every rib must work with the grain, never against it. The sea forgives no shortcuts. Olivia smiled quietly. After years spent reading financial reports filled with technical language and legal terms, she found something strangely comforting about instructions written by someone who clearly believed skill carried responsibility. These notes were practical, thoughtful, and deeply human. Over the next several hours, she gently unrolled the remaining parchments from the cedar chest. Most contained boat designs of varying sizes, while others focused on individual construction methods. Detailed joinery, or improved hull shapes. Several included small sketches of specialized tools accompanied by handwritten explanations. Each drawing reflected years of experience patiently recorded for someone willing to learn. There was no sense of pride or self-promotion in the notes. Elijah wrote as though preserving knowledge mattered more than receiving credit for it. The following morning, Olivia photographed several pages before carefully placing the originals back inside protective canvas. She wanted another opinion before risking further handling. Jack arrived shortly afterward, carrying lumber for another section of roof repairs. As soon as he stepped into the office, Olivia spread one of the blueprints across the desk. His easy smile disappeared almost immediately. He leaned closer, studying the drawing without speaking. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Where did you find this?" Olivia explained the hidden basement and cedar chest. Jack shook his head in disbelief. "I've worked with wood my entire life," he said quietly. "Whoever drew this understood boats at a level very few people ever reach." He carefully pointed toward the sweeping lines of the hull. "See this curve? Most builders would simplify it because it's easier. Elijah didn't. He designed it this way because it rides heavy water better." Olivia listened with growing fascination. "So these aren't ordinary plans?" "Not even close." Jack smiled faintly. "This is the work of someone who spent decades perfecting his craft." He noticed another folded sheet partially tucked beneath the blueprint and gently pulled it free. Instead of construction drawings, it showed an old hand-drawn map of the harbor and surrounding shoreline. Faded ink marked several buildings that no longer existed, along with docks, warehouses, and boat slips stretching far beyond the present waterfront. One location had been circled twice in dark pencil. "Do you recognize any of this?" Olivia asked. Jack studied the map for several moments before nodding. "Most of these buildings disappeared years ago, but this—" He pointed toward the circled location near the far end of the harbor. "That used to be the original boatyard, before storms destroyed the docks. Hardly anyone goes there anymore." Olivia compared the map with modern satellite images on her laptop. The shoreline had changed over the decades, but enough landmarks remained to estimate where the old yard had once stood. "Do you think it's worth visiting?" Jack nodded. "If Elijah marked it, there's probably a reason." The next afternoon, they followed a narrow trail leading away from the active harbor toward an overgrown stretch of coastline. Thick grass covered the remains of weathered pilings jutting from shallow water. Rotting timbers, barely visible beneath the sand, hinted at structures long since reclaimed by the sea. Jack walked slowly, occasionally stopping to compare the landscape with the old map. "The shoreline shifted," he said, "but I'm fairly sure the main boatyard stood right about here." Olivia looked across the quiet cove, trying to imagine craftsmen shaping massive wooden vessels where only seabirds gathered now. They searched for over an hour, finding little more than rusted hardware, broken stones, and fragments of weathered planks. No hidden buildings or forgotten storehouses waited beneath the grass. Yet standing where Elijah had once worked gave Olivia a stronger sense of the man whose careful handwriting filled the blueprints. This had been a place of labor, patience, and shared purpose before time slowly erased it from memory. As they prepared to leave, Jack noticed several shallow grooves carved into an old granite foundation stone. "Boat cradles," he explained. "They used rollers here to launch finished hulls into the water." Olivia photographed the marks before folding the map safely inside a protective folder. Even small details seemed worth preserving now. Back at the workshop that evening, she returned every blueprint to the office desk, arranging them in the order they had been stored inside the cedar chest. As she compared one drawing with another, something suddenly caught her attention. The numbering written neatly in the lower corners skipped unexpectedly. Plan 4 was followed by Plan 6. Another sequence jumped from 11 to 14. At first, she assumed Elijah had simply created unrelated designs, but then she noticed rough tears along the edges of several sheets. They had not worn away naturally with age. Portions had been deliberately removed. One blueprint ended abruptly where an entire section should have continued. Another contained handwritten references directing the reader to notes that no longer existed. Olivia carefully searched through every remaining parchment again, hoping the missing pieces had simply been folded separately inside the chest. They were nowhere to be found. She slowly placed both damaged drawings side by side, her eyes fixed on the jagged, torn edges. Someone had intentionally removed part of Elijah Rowe's master blueprints long before the cedar chest was hidden beneath the workshop. Olivia Bennett sat quietly in the office as the evening light faded across the old workshop floor. The damaged blueprints remained spread before her, each torn edge fitting the story Eleanor Pierce had begun telling about Elijah Rowe. These were not papers worn away by time. Someone had removed entire sections with deliberate care. The cuts were clean enough to suggest they had been made while the parchment was still strong, long before age had made it fragile. Whoever had done it had wanted specific pages, not random pieces. Olivia carefully photographed every damaged sheet before placing thin archival paper beneath each one to prevent further wear. Her years on Wall Street had trained her to study patterns hidden inside numbers. Now she found herself applying the same discipline to old parchment. The missing pages were not scattered randomly. Every gap appeared to interrupt a sequence. A construction method would suddenly stop. A set of measurements would end halfway through an explanation. Notes referenced diagrams that no longer existed. Elijah had clearly intended these plans to be read as a complete collection. Someone had intentionally broken that sequence. The next morning, she carried copies of several damaged drawings to the town library. Eleanor welcomed her with a warm smile before carefully adjusting her glasses to examine the reproductions. They settled once again beside the large window overlooking the harbor. Eleanor compared the torn edges one by one without speaking. After several minutes, she gently placed the final sheet on the table. "These weren't accidents," she said softly. "I agree," Olivia nodded. "Do you think Elijah removed them himself?" Eleanor considered the question before shaking her head. If he wanted to destroy his work, why save everything else so carefully? Olivia glanced toward the harbor outside. Then someone else did it. Perhaps, Eleanor folded her hands thoughtfully. But whoever removed them understood exactly what they were taking. She reached into a nearby archive box and withdrew a faded black and white photograph, protected inside a clear sleeve. "I found this after you visited yesterday." Olivia leaned closer. The photograph showed nearly a dozen men standing proudly beside the skeleton of a large wooden boat under construction. Heavy timber frames curved upward behind them. Every face carried the quiet confidence of skilled craftsmen. Near the center stood a broad-shouldered man with rolled sleeves, one hand resting on a massive beam. Even without a caption, Olivia immediately guessed who he was. Elijah Rowe. Eleanor smiled. "Yes," She pointed toward the man. "That's the only confirmed photograph of him the library still has." Olivia studied the image carefully. The workshop behind the crew looked unmistakably like the building she now owned, although it appeared vibrant and full of activity rather than silent and abandoned. Stacks of fresh lumber filled the yard. Windows reflected sunlight instead of dust. Finished boats rested along the shoreline awaiting launch. On the back of the photograph, someone had written only a date and 4 simple words: Rowboat Workshop Crew. There were no names identifying the other workers. Olivia wondered how many stories had quietly disappeared with them. Before leaving, she thanked Eleanor for preserving the photograph. "History survives because someone decides it's worth saving," Eleanor said as she carefully returned it to its protective sleeve. Those words stayed with Olivia during the short walk back toward the harbor. On her way, she stopped at the local hardware store to purchase additional supplies for repairing loose floorboards. Behind the counter stood a gray-haired man arranging shelves of bolts and hand tools. He introduced himself as Tom Harris. After helping her gather the materials, he casually asked how the old workshop was coming along. "Slowly," Olivia admitted with a smile, "but it's beginning to feel alive again." Tom chuckled. "That's more optimism than most folks around here have about that place." Olivia hesitated before asking, "Did you ever know much about the workshop?" Tom rested both hands on the counter. "Only bits and pieces. I was a kid when the building was already sitting empty." He thought for a moment before adding, "Funny thing, though, about 15 years ago, someone came into town asking questions about it." Olivia looked up. "Questions?" "Wanted to know who owned it, whether it might ever be sold." "Did they buy it?" Tom shook his head. "No. County already had it tied up because of taxes. Whoever that fellow was, he left after a day or two. Never saw him again." "Did he say why he wanted it?" "Not really," Tom shrugged. "Just seemed unusually interested in an old boat shop most people ignored." The conversation left Olivia thoughtful. She wasn't sure whether the visitor had been searching for the workshop itself or something connected to it, but Tom remembered the curiosity clearly enough after all those years. Carrying her supplies, she returned to the workshop, determined to continue searching for anything that might explain the missing blueprints. The office became her first priority. She carefully emptied every drawer of the old wooden desk, examining ledgers, broken pencils, rusted measuring tools, and yellowed invoices whose ink had nearly disappeared. Most papers had long since become unreadable from age and moisture. She inspected the underside of each drawer, tapped gently along the desk panels, and measured their depth against the exterior dimensions. One side seemed slightly thicker than it should have been. Running her fingers along the interior edge, she felt a narrow groove almost invisible beneath years of dust. Pressing gently, she heard a quiet click. A thin wooden panel slid backward, revealing a hidden compartment no wider than her hand. Inside rested a single folded envelope wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Unlike the papers scattered elsewhere throughout the office, this one had been protected from moisture. Olivia unfolded it with great care. The handwriting matched the elegant script she had seen throughout Elijah Rowe's blueprints. It was not a long letter. Most of the page contained practical notes about timber deliveries and schedules, but near the bottom one sentence had been written separately, darker than the rest, as though added later after much thought. "Everything depends upon the last commission. When it is finished, the plans must not remain where others expect to find them." Olivia read the sentence again, feeling both excitement and uncertainty. The letter offered no explanation of what the last commission had been, nor why the plans needed to disappear. It simply ended with Elijah's familiar signature, leaving Olivia alone in the quiet office, staring at the words that had raised far more questions than they answered. The letter remained on Olivia Bennett's desk long after the evening shadows settled across the workshop. She read Elijah Rowe's final sentence again and again. Everything depends upon the last commission. When it is finished, the plans must not remain where others expect to find them. It was the closest thing she had found to an explanation, yet it answered almost nothing. What had the last commission been? Why would a master craftsman hide years of work instead of passing it to another builder? She carefully returned the letter to its oilcloth wrapping before locking it inside a fireproof document case she had purchased in town. Every new discovery made the responsibility feel heavier. These were no longer simply interesting historical documents. They were pieces of a life that someone had intentionally protected. The following morning, Jack arrived carrying replacement flooring for one corner of the workshop. Before beginning work, Olivia showed him copies of the letter. He read silently, then looked around the empty building. If Elijah wrote this near the end of his career, he said thoughtfully, he already knew the workshop wasn't going to stay the way it had been. Olivia nodded. Eleanor said factories were taking over. Jack rested a hand on one of the old workbenches. Small shops couldn't compete. Machine-built boats were faster, cheaper, and easier to produce. People stopped paying for craftsmanship because they couldn't afford to wait. They spent the morning replacing damaged boards while talking about how boat building had changed over the years. Jack explained that older builders selected every piece of timber by hand, matching the natural grain to each section of the hull. Industrial production valued speed instead of individual judgment. Listening to him, Olivia found herself thinking about Wall Street. There, too, efficiency had gradually replaced personal connection. Decisions once made face-to-face had become numbers moving across computer screens. Different industries, she realized, often lost the same things for the same reasons. During lunch, she visited Eleanor at the library once more, hoping the archives might contain references to Elijah's final years. Together, they searched newspaper clippings, shipping records, and local newsletters preserved inside aging binders. Most simply documented the steady decline of independent boatyards as larger manufacturers expanded along the coast. One article described several workshops closing within a single decade. Another praised factory production for making boats more affordable. Elijah Rowe's name appeared only occasionally, usually in advertisements offering repairs or custom-built fishing vessels. Then Eleanor uncovered a small newspaper feature printed near the end of Elijah's career. It described him as one of the last traditional builders still working by hand. There was no dramatic farewell, no celebration, only a brief mention that his workshop had completed another custom vessel despite difficult economic conditions. History can disappear quietly, Eleanor said as she closed the binder. Sometimes people don't realize they're witnessing the end of an era until years later. Olivia carried those words back to the harbor as she unlocked the workshop that afternoon. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt like the final witness to a disappearing craft. She wandered slowly between the old benches, imagining the sounds that had once filled the space. Planes smoothing cedar planks, hammers striking wooden pegs, voices discussing measurements, and sawdust drifting through sunlight. The workshop had never been merely a place where boats were assembled. It had been where knowledge passed from experienced hands to younger ones, one careful lesson at a time. Continuing her search, Olivia opened another storage cabinet that had remained untouched because its swollen door barely moved. Inside, she found bundles of receipts, delivery records, and customer invoices tied neatly with faded string. Most documented ordinary purchases of lumber, iron fittings, paint, and sailcloth. Yet among the papers lay a small notebook written in Elijah's familiar handwriting. Unlike the blueprints, It contained brief daily entries rather than technical drawings. Many described practical challenges, weather delaying deliveries, shortages of quality oak, repairs requested by fishermen after harsh winters. As the entries progressed, a different tone slowly emerged. Elijah wrote less about business and more about people. One note mentioned delaying payment for a widowed fisherman whose boat required repairs before the spring season. Another recorded extra work completed without charge because a family's livelihood depended upon launching before the weather changed. Olivia realized the workshop had served more than paying customers. It had quietly supported neighbors whenever possible. Several pages later, Elijah reflected on the changing industry. He never criticized new factories directly, but sadness lingered beneath his words. He wrote that boats were becoming products instead of companions. Builders who once knew every customer by name were slowly disappearing. The craft itself was surviving, but something essential was being left behind. Olivia closed the notebook for a moment, absorbing the quiet honesty of the entries. Elijah had measured success differently from the investors she once worked beside. He seemed to believe the true value of his work could never be calculated in money alone. As evening approached, she continued reading until reaching the final pages. The handwriting had become slightly less steady, though every sentence remained carefully formed. Elijah described completing what he simply called his final boat. He offered no details about its owner, only gratitude that his hands had remained steady enough to finish the work properly. Then came another short entry, written several days later. The workshop has always belonged to the community more than it has belonged to me. Long after these doors close, I hope someone remembers that every vessel built here carried more than timber across the water. They carried families, friendships, and futures. Olivia looked around the silent room with renewed appreciation. The weathered walls suddenly seemed filled with invisible stories. Near the bottom of the last page, Elijah added one final paragraph in darker ink, as though he wanted to ensure these words would never be overlooked. The most important plans cannot remain among the ordinary drawings. When my work is finished, they must be hidden where only patience, respect, and honest hands will think to search. Olivia slowly lowered the notebook onto the desk. She understood now that Elijah himself had decided to conceal something far more valuable than the blueprints already resting inside the cedar chest. Somewhere within the old boat workshop, the plans he considered most important were still waiting to be found. The final lines in Elijah Rowe's notebook left Olivia Bennett standing silently in the office long after darkness settled outside the workshop. The most important plans cannot remain among the ordinary drawings. When my work is finished, they must be hidden where only patience, respect, and honest hands will think to search. She had already searched the office, the basement, and nearly every cabinet in the building. Whatever Elijah had hidden was somewhere else. The next morning, she spread copies of the notebook, the damaged blueprints, and the harbor map across the old desk. Jack Sullivan joined her before beginning another day of repairs. Together, they read Elijah's final entry once more. Jack rested both hands on the scarred workbench beside them. "If I were hiding something important inside a workshop," he said thoughtfully, "I wouldn't put it where visitors might stumble across it. I'd hide it somewhere every craftsman used every day, but never thought twice about." Olivia looked around the room. Every wall held shelves. Every corner contained tools or storage racks. Nothing stood out. Then her eyes settled on the enormous workbench dominating the center of the building. Unlike the others, it had never been moved. Massive oak legs disappeared beneath decades of sawdust, and thousands of hammer marks covered its thick surface. "You think the bench?" Jack smiled. "If Elijah spent most of his life building boats, that's where he spent most of his time." They cleared away old tools and swept years of dust from around the bench. Removing it proved far more difficult than expected. The structure had been built from solid hardwood and weighed hundreds of pounds. Even after emptying every drawer, it refused to budge. Jack knelt to examine the base more closely. "It's anchored," he said. "Not nailed, bolted." Olivia crouched beside him. Rusted iron bolts disappeared through the heavy legs into the wooden floor beneath. Working patiently with penetrating oil, old wrenches, and more determination than strength. They loosened each bolt one at a time. Several snapped before finally giving way. Nearly 2 hours later, they managed to slide the massive bench aside only a few feet. A lighter rectangle marked the floor where sunlight had never reached. Olivia brushed away loose sawdust. One section of floorboards looked slightly different from the rest. The wood matched perfectly in color, but the grain ran in another direction. Jack tapped gently with the handle of his hammer. Most boards answered with a solid sound. One returned a noticeably hollow echo. They exchanged a glance without speaking. Olivia carefully pried up the first board. Whoever had installed it had done so with remarkable precision. There were no obvious seams and almost no visible nails. One by one, the boards lifted away until a shallow cavity appeared beneath the floor. Resting inside was a rectangular metal box coated with dark protective paint. Although dust covered its surface, there was almost no rust. Elijah had chosen the container carefully, knowing moisture would eventually destroy ordinary wood. Together they lifted the surprisingly heavy box onto the workbench. The lid resisted briefly before releasing with a soft click. Inside, every item had been wrapped individually in waxed canvas. Olivia unfolded the first bundle with slow, careful movements. More blueprints appeared, larger and even more detailed than those stored inside the cedar chest. Many filled in the missing sequences she had discovered earlier. Torn sections now made sense as complete designs emerged once again. Additional handwritten notes described improved construction methods and careful refinements developed over many years. Elijah had continued perfecting his craft until the very end. Beneath the blueprints rested several thick ledgers, unlike anything Olivia had seen before. She opened the first volume expecting financial records. Instead, she found page after page listing boat names, launch dates, recipients, and short handwritten remarks. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Then certain notes began repeating. Paid when able. No charge. Community launch. Replacement after storm. Anonymous contribution received. Olivia turned another page. The pattern continued year after year. Hundreds of names filled the ledgers, families, fishermen, lobster crews, widows, young brothers beginning their first business together, church committees, volunteer rescue crews. Beside many entries, Elijah had quietly recorded reduced prices, delayed payments, donated labor, or complete forgiveness of debt. There were no dramatic explanations, only simple notes written as naturally as measurements on a blueprint. Jack leaned over the ledger, reading silently. After several moments, he whispered, "He wasn't keeping business records." Olivia slowly shook her head. No. She carefully turned another page. The names continued. Some entries mentioned boats repaired after violent storms before owners could afford payment. Others described small skiffs built for families starting over after accidents or illness. Elijah had documented every vessel that left the workshop, but the ledgers revealed something deeper than production. They recorded acts of quiet generosity spread across decades. There was no sign that he expected recognition. Most of the notes were so brief that only someone reading the complete collection would notice the pattern. Olivia reached the final pages of one ledger, where Elijah had written a short reflection beneath the last completed entry. A workshop earns its living by building boats. It earns its place by helping people stay upon the water together. She closed the book gently, overcome by the quiet dignity contained within those simple words. After years spent evaluating profit margins, quarterly growth, and market value, she found herself holding records that measured success in an entirely different way. Elijah had not been preserving sales history. He had been preserving evidence of a community caring for itself one boat at a time. The hidden metal box contained the blueprints he considered most important, but the ledgers revealed why he had hidden them so carefully. They were never only instructions for building wooden boats. They were the history of lives strengthened, families supported, and neighbors quietly lifted through honest work and kindness. Olivia looked across the silent workshop, no longer seeing an abandoned building waiting to be restored. She saw a place where craftsmanship and compassion had once been inseparable, and she realized that Elijah Rowe's greatest legacy had never been the boats themselves. It had always been the people they carried. For the next several days, Olivia Bennett and Eleanor Pierce worked through the hidden ledgers one page at a time. The books were too fragile to move repeatedly, so Eleanor brought archival sleeves, cotton gloves, and a portable scanner to the boat workshop. They set up a long table near the office window, where morning light fell across the worn floorboards. Olivia read names aloud, while Eleanor searched old census records, newspaper archives, church registers, and harbor permits. At first, the process felt painfully slow. Some families had moved away. Others had changed the spelling of their names over generations. Boat names had been reused, and many records from Elijah Rowe's era were incomplete. Yet every successful match revealed another life connected to the workshop. A fisherman whose vessel had been rebuilt after a winter storm later employed 6 men from the town. A widow who received a small skiff without charge used it to carry laundry and supplies between islands. 2 brothers whose debt Elijah postponed eventually opened a smokehouse that remained in their family for decades. The ledgers did not simply record boats. They showed how one act of help could travel through an entire community. Eleanor paused over one entry and adjusted her glasses. "This family is still here," she said. "The Mercers. Their grandson runs the fuel dock." Olivia looked at the faded note beside the name. "Hull replaced after grounding. Labor donated." "Do you think he knows?" "I doubt it." Eleanor smiled gently. "Most kindness disappears before the next generation learns where it began." Olivia made a list of families they could contact. She worried that people might consider the old records intrusive, but the first conversations proved otherwise. Some listeners fell silent when they heard Elijah's name. Others remembered fragments of stories from grandparents who had spoken about a builder who never turned away someone in trouble. One woman arrived the next morning carrying a faded photograph of her great-grandfather standing beside a narrow fishing boat. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, "Row Yard, Spring Launch." She placed it on the workbench with trembling hands. "My father always said this boat saved the family," she told Olivia. "I thought he meant because they caught fish with it. Maybe he meant something more." Word spread quickly after that. People who had ignored the abandoned workshop for years began stopping by with old photographs, rusted tools, launch receipts, and stories preserved through family memory. Olivia kept a careful record of every item and refused to accept anything permanently without written permission. Her Wall Street habits returned in useful ways. She created inventories, labeled documents, built timelines, and organized each family connection. For the first time, the skills she had once used to analyze corporations were helping restore something human. Jack Sullivan continued repairing the building while watching the steady stream of visitors with growing curiosity. One afternoon, he entered the office carrying a plank beneath his arm and noticed Olivia studying a ledger beside an old town directory. "Any more familiar names?" he asked. Olivia hesitated. "Actually, yes."
She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to an entry dated more than 70 years earlier. The name read, Patrick Sullivan. Beside it, Elijah had written, 22-foot lobster boat. Materials charged at cost. Remaining labor covered privately. Family recovering after illness. Jack stared at the page without moving. Patrick was my grandfather. Olivia had suspected as much.
But hearing the confirmation made the discovery feel heavier. Did he ever mention Elijah? Not directly. Jack sat slowly on the edge of the desk. He used to talk about his first real boat. Said a builder gave him time when no bank would. I always assumed he meant extra time to pay. His eyes remained fixed on Elijah's note. My grandmother had been sick that year. Medical bills nearly ruined them. Eleanor opened a folder containing the matching harbor registration. The boat had remained in the Sullivan family for 28 years. Jack touched the edge of the copied record, his expression shifting between pride and sadness. That boat paid for my father's schooling, he said quietly, and kept food on the table before that. Olivia watched him absorb the truth until that moment. Elijah's generosity had been a pattern in old books. Now it had a face standing directly in front of her. Jack looked across the workshop where he had spent weeks repairing beams and replacing boards. I thought I was helping you save an old building, he said. Turns out this place helped save my family first. From then on, he refused payment for several smaller repairs. Though Olivia argued with him until he agreed to accept the cost of materials, their working relationship changed subtly. He no longer spoke of the workshop as Olivia's strange purchase. He spoke about what they needed to protect. Community interest grew faster than the building could comfortably handle. Visitors arrived during working hours, sometimes stepping around ladders and exposed flooring to see the ledgers. Olivia posted temporary safety signs and limited access to the office, promising that copies of the records would soon be available. Tom Harris appeared one morning carrying an old brass plane that had belonged to his father. He placed it on the bench and cleared his throat. Might have come from here, he said. Figured you could take a look. Olivia noticed that he no longer called the workshop a lost cause. By the end of the week, the harbor newspaper sent a reporter to photograph the hidden blueprints and interview families connected to Elijah's records. The article described the discovery as a forgotten history of coastal generosity. Olivia was uncomfortable seeing her own name in print, but she understood that public attention might help preserve the documents. 2 days after the article appeared, a dark sedan pulled into the gravel lot. A sharply dressed man stepped out, surveyed the waterfront, and entered the workshop without introducing himself. He studied the exposed beams, the wide doors, and the view of the harbor with the practiced attention of someone calculating potential. Olivia approached him near the central workbench. "Can I help you?" He handed her a business card bearing the name of a regional development company. "I represent investors looking for waterfront properties," he said. "This parcel has considerable potential." Olivia glanced at the card, but did not take it. "The building isn't for sale." The man smiled as though she had misunderstood. "You paid $350 for it. My clients are prepared to make an immediate offer far beyond that." Jack stopped working across the room. Eleanor looked up from the ledgers. The visitor lowered his voice and named a figure large enough to make Olivia's old financial instincts react instantly. It was more money than she had expected to see for years. "You wouldn't need to repair another board," he added. "We could close quickly." Olivia looked past him toward Elijah's hidden records, the family photographs, and the workbench beneath which generations of kindness had waited to be found. Then she looked back at the man, realizing the abandoned workshop had finally become valuable to people who had never cared what happened inside it. Olivia Bennett looked at the business card in the developer's hand, then toward the hidden ledgers resting safely inside archival sleeves. For a brief moment, The offer filled her mind with everything it could solve. She could recover her savings, avoid years of repairs, and walk away with more money than she had expected to earn after leaving Wall Street. The calculation came naturally. She knew how to weigh risk, estimate future costs, and recognize an unusually profitable exit. A year earlier, she might have called the decision obvious, but the boat workshop was no longer an abandoned structure she had bought for $350. It held the stories of families who had survived because Elijah Rowe had chosen generosity over profit. Selling the property now would reduce that history to waterfront square footage. Olivia finally met the man's patient gaze. "No," she said. His smile weakened. "You may want time to consider. I've considered it." She handed the card back. "The workshop isn't for sale." The developer glanced toward the harbor and the wide entrance doors. "Buildings like this are expensive to maintain. Sentiment doesn't pay for restoration. Neither does regret." Jack Sullivan lowered his hammer, hiding a small smile. Eleanor Pierce sat quietly beside the ledgers, her expression calm but proud. The man slipped the card into his coat pocket. "My clients may increase the offer." Olivia shook her head. "The answer will still be no." After he left, the sedan disappeared along the narrow coastal road. Olivia remained near the doorway, her confidence slowly giving way to fear. Turning down the offer had felt right, but the practical problems remained. The roof needed more work. Several windows required replacement. The foundation along the harbor side had to be reinforced before another harsh winter. She had enough money to continue for a while, but not indefinitely. Jack seemed to understand what she was thinking. "You made the right decision," he said. "That doesn't make it an easy one." Eleanor closed the ledger in front of her. "Then we help people understand what they're being asked to save within days." Eleanor proposed a public exhibition inside the workshop. They would display copies of Elijah's blueprints, selected ledger entries, the old crew photograph, and the artifacts residents had already shared. The event would not be polished or permanent. Its purpose was simply to let the town see the history hidden behind the weathered walls. Olivia hesitated because much of the building remained under repair, but Jack marked safe walking paths and secured the unstable sections. Tom Harris donated temporary lighting and folding tables from his hardware store. Eleanor contacted families whose names appeared in the ledgers, while Olivia prepared labels explaining each document without overstating what they knew. On the morning of the exhibition, rain moved across the harbor in a fine gray mist. Olivia feared the weather would keep people away. Instead, the first visitors arrived before the doors officially opened. They came carrying umbrellas, framed photographs, boxes of old receipts, rusted tools, and family stories. Some recognized names immediately. Others searched the copied lists in silence, tracing lines with careful fingers. A middle-aged fisherman found his great-grandmother's surname beside an entry for a repaired dory, completed without charge after her husband's death. He stood still for a long time before quietly calling his sister. An elderly man brought a launch photograph showing 3 boys beside a newly finished skiff. On the back, his father had written that Mr. Rowe accepted payment in small amounts over 7 years. Another family arrived with a wooden model boat believed to have been made by one of Elijah's apprentices. Eleanor recorded every detail, while Olivia assigned temporary numbers to each item. The workshop slowly filled with voices, memories, and the soft shock of recognition. For the first time in decades, the long room sounded alive. Near midday, Olivia stood beside the central workbench and read several passages from Elijah's ledgers. She spoke about boats repaired after storms, vessels built for families recovering from illness, and debts quietly forgiven when fishing seasons failed. She did not present Elijah as a flawless hero. She described him as a working craftsman who had used what he knew to help people remain on the water. The simplicity of that truth affected the room more deeply than any dramatic speech could have. When she finished, Jack stepped forward holding a copy of his grandfather, Patrick Sullivan's entry. His voice tightened as he explained how that boat had supported his family for nearly 3 decades. "I grew up believing my grandfather survived because he worked harder than everyone else," Jack said. "He did work hard, but now I know someone also gave him a chance when he needed one." The room became completely silent. Then Tom Harris cleared his throat near the back. He admitted that he had once believed the workshop should be demolished. "I thought the building had outlived its usefulness," he said. "Turns out I was looking at the boards and missing everything they held." Before leaving that afternoon, Tom offered lumber, hardware, and several days of labor toward the restoration. He insisted it was not charity. "Consider it overdue maintenance from the town," he told Olivia. Other offers followed. A retired electrician volunteered to inspect the wiring. 2 fishermen offered to repair the exterior siding. Families promised copies of photographs and letters. Olivia felt the burden she had been carrying begin to spread across many willing hands. The workshop was no longer hers to defend alone. Over the next week, repairs moved faster than they had in months. Tom worked beside Jack replacing damaged boards along the western wall. Olivia organized donated materials while Eleanor continued building the family archive. One afternoon, Jack removed a warp interior panel near the rear storage area, behind it. He expected to find insulation or structural framing. Instead, his crowbar struck a hollow space. "Olivia!" he called. She crossed the workshop as Tom pulled away another section of wood. A narrow cavity appeared between the inner wall and the original exterior timbers. Dust drifted into the light. Jack reached inside and felt along the hidden ledge. His hand closed around something small and solid. He carefully withdrew a rectangular wooden box wrapped tightly in darkened oilcloth. Unlike the metal container beneath the workbench, this box was no larger than a family Bible. A faded cord had been tied around it 3 times, and beneath the knot rested a small brass tag bearing Elijah Rowe's initials. Olivia stared at the box in Jack's hands, understanding at once that they had found the final thing Elijah had hidden behind the old wooden wall. Jack Sullivan carefully placed the oilcloth-wrapped wooden box on the old workbench, while Olivia Bennett and Eleanor Pierce gathered beside him. Dust still floated through the afternoon light, where the hidden wall cavity had been opened. For several moments, no one spoke. The small brass tag bearing Elijah Rowe's initials seemed almost too ordinary for something hidden so deliberately. Olivia untied the faded cord with slow, careful movements, preserving every knot before gently folding back the weathered oilcloth. Inside rested a leather-bound notebook, several folded letters tied with blue ribbon, and a final bundle of rolled blueprints protected inside waxed paper. Unlike the earlier plans stored beneath the workshop floor, these drawings showed no torn edges. They appeared complete. Olivia carefully unrolled the first sheet. It contained the finished version of the design whose missing sections had puzzled her since discovering the cedar chest. Every measurement was present. Every handwritten instruction flowed naturally from beginning to end. Elijah had not hidden these plans because they were unfinished. He had hidden them because they mattered most. Eleanor lifted the notebook with cotton gloves and slowly opened its first page. The familiar handwriting immediately confirmed it belonged to Elijah. These entries were written later than the others Olivia had already found. The lines showed a slightly unsteady hand, but the thoughts remained clear. Elijah described completing his final years in the workshop while watching traditional boat building disappear from the coastline. He wrote without bitterness. Factories had changed the industry, and he accepted that progress could not be reversed. What troubled him was something different. He feared that future builders would remember only faster production and lower costs, while forgetting why many of the boats had been built in the first place. Several pages later, the notebook finally explained the hidden blueprints. Elijah wrote that the completed collection represented more than advanced craftsmanship. They contained designs refined over decades for dependable fishing boats, rescue skiffs, family workboats, and community vessels that could be built using practical materials available to ordinary people. Every improvement had been tested through years on rough coastal waters. He wanted the knowledge preserved exactly as he had learned it. Yet he refused to leave the collection where anyone interested only in profit might claim it as a commercial asset. He believed the plans belonged to those willing to protect both the craft and the people it served. Olivia quietly turned another page. The notebook described no secret fortune, no lost ownership claim, and no hidden invention. Instead, Elijah explained that he had spent years quietly helping neighbors because every strong community depended on ordinary people lifting one another through difficult seasons. The workshop had survived not because of successful business alone, but because customers often became friends, apprentices became teachers, and one repaired boat frequently supported several families beyond its owner. If those relationships disappeared, the finest blueprints in the world would become little more than paper. Eleanor wiped away a quiet tear before reaching the final section. There, Elijah explained why the documents had been separated. The working blueprints had been hidden beneath the floor where a patient craftsman might eventually discover them. The personal letters had been placed inside the wall because they were meant for the person who chose to preserve the workshop rather than exploit it. "If you are reading this," Olivia read aloud, "then you have already proven that buildings are remembered by what happens inside them, not by what they are worth." The room remained silent. Even Jack, who rarely showed emotion openly, stared toward the harbor for several moments before speaking. "Sounds like he was writing to you." Olivia smiled faintly but shook her head. "I think he was writing to whoever came after him." Beneath the notebook rested several folded letters addressed to no one by name. They contained personal reflections rather than instructions. Elijah thanked the craftsmen who had worked beside him over the years, remembered families who had trusted him during difficult times, and expressed hope that the workshop would someday become useful again. Even if boats were no longer built there every day, he never asked to be remembered as a great builder. He asked only that the knowledge continue serving others. The final letter ended with a single request. "Do not measure this place by the number of boats it produced. Measure it by the number of people who found hope after walking through its doors." Olivia carefully returned every page to its protective sleeve. She finally understood why the blueprints had been hidden. Elijah feared neither theft nor obscurity as much as he feared the loss of purpose. The plans had value only if they remained connected to the generosity that created them. News of the final discovery spread quickly through the town. Eleanor prepared careful summaries for the Historical Society while ensuring the original papers remained protected inside the workshop. Local historians visited to examine copies of the documents and agreed that the collection represented one of the most complete surviving records of traditional community boat building in the region. Families continued donating photographs, tools, journals, and stories connected to Elijah's work. What had begun as a forgotten building was becoming a shared history belonging to the entire harbor. During the following town council meeting, residents filled nearly every seat. Olivia attended quietly with Jack. Eleanor and Tom Harris expecting only a discussion about preserving the documents. Instead, one council member proposed officially recognizing the boat workshop as a protected local heritage site. Others supported creating a permanent historical center where Elijah's blueprints, ledgers, photographs, and community donations could remain together. Family after family stood to speak in favor of preserving the building. Some described relatives whose names appeared in the ledgers, Others thanked Olivia for refusing the developer's offer. Even Tom admitted publicly that he had once believed the workshop should be demolished before discovering what had been hidden inside its walls. By the end of the meeting, the vote to preserve the boat workshop passed unanimously. Leaving the town hall that evening, Olivia felt the weight she had carried since opening the first blueprint finally begin to lift. The responsibility no longer belonged to one person. The community had chosen to protect its own history. Later that night, she returned alone to the quiet workshop. The restored workbench stood beneath the hanging lights, while the carefully protected documents rested inside their cases. Olivia opened Elijah's notebook one final time before locking it away. On the last page, beneath every reflection and every blueprint, Elijah had written a single closing message in steady, deliberate handwriting. A boat built with skill may cross the sea. A boat built with kindness will carry generations. Olivia quietly closed the notebook, knowing those words would become the heart of everything the old boat workshop would one day represent. Winter returned to the Maine coastline almost exactly 1 year after Olivia Bennett first unlocked the weathered front door of the abandoned boat workshop. Snow covered the harbor in a quiet blanket of white, softening the outlines of fishing boats tied to the docks and settling gently across the roof that Jack Sullivan and dozens of volunteers had spent months restoring. The broken windows had been replaced with hand-built frames matching the originals. The warped siding had been repaired board by board instead of replaced. Fresh paint protected the exterior without hiding the marks of age that told the building's story. Inside, the workshop looked remarkably similar to the place Elijah Rowe would have recognized, yet every corner now carried new purpose. The old workbenches had been preserved. The restored central bench remained where generations of craftsmen had once worked, with a small plaque explaining that the hidden metal box containing Elijah's ledgers and blueprints had been discovered beneath it. Display cases built by local woodworkers protected the original documents under carefully controlled conditions. Copies of the master builder's blueprints rested nearby, so visitors could study every line without risking damage to the originals. Along one wall, photographs donated by local families traced nearly a century of harbor life. Another exhibit displayed the hand tools, measuring gauges, wooden planes, and carving knives once used inside the workshop. None of the displays celebrated Elijah Rowe as a legend. Instead, they honored the community that had shaped and been shaped by his work. Olivia walked through the building before sunrise, making one final inspection before the opening ceremony. She straightened a display label, adjusted a photograph that leaned slightly to one side, and gently brushed an invisible speck of dust from the protective glass covering Elijah's notebook. She paused beside the workbench where the hidden box had rested beneath the floor. A year earlier, she had stood in the same place, wondering whether she had made the worst financial decision of her life. Now she found herself smiling at how impossible it would have been to measure the value of everything the workshop had given her. By mid-morning, the harbor filled with visitors arriving for the town's first Winter Heritage Festival in decades. Children laughed as volunteers demonstrated traditional woodworking techniques outside beneath canvas shelters. Fishermen explained how older wooden boats had been maintained through harsh winters. Local musicians played familiar folk songs while neighbors shared hot cider and homemade bread. The boat workshop stood at the center of it all, not as a forgotten building rescued from decay, but as a living gathering place once again. Families entered slowly, moving from one display to another with quiet curiosity. Many stopped first before the copied ledger pages listing names Elijah had recorded over the years. Olivia watched people search carefully through the entries. Some found familiar family names almost immediately. Others needed help tracing older spellings or connecting relatives across generations. Every discovery carried its own emotion. One elderly man smiled through tears after locating the record of the small fishing boat his grandfather had received following a devastating storm. A young couple pointed excitedly toward an entry connected to the wife's great-great-grandparents. Parents knelt beside their children, explaining that their family's story had become part of the town's history long before anyone alive today had been born. The workshop echoed with quiet conversations that seemed to bridge generations. Eleanor Pierce stood near the archive displays, answering questions with the patience and warmth that had guided Olivia since the beginning. She watched children carefully studying copies of Elijah's drawings and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "History survives," she whispered to Olivia, "when someone chooses to keep telling it." Olivia nodded. "You were right from the very beginning." Eleanor gently squeezed her hand. "No, you were the one who chose not to walk away." In another corner of the workshop, Jack had organized a small learning area where young visitors could safely handle scrap wood and simple hand tools under supervision. He demonstrated how grain direction affected strength, repeating many of the same lessons Elijah had written beside his blueprints decades earlier. There were no complicated lectures, only patient explanations and encouraging smiles. Olivia paused nearby, watching a boy proudly smooth his first wooden board while Jack praised his careful work instead of his speed. The moment reminded her of Elijah's notes written so many years before. Skill mattered, but patience mattered more. Tom Harris arrived carrying the old brass plane he had donated months earlier. It now rested inside a display case alongside a short explanation of the local craftsman who had kept traditional woodworking alive. Looking around the crowded workshop, Tom chuckled softly. "Hard to believe I once wanted this place torn down." Olivia smiled. "People change. Sometimes buildings help them do that." Throughout the afternoon, former residents returned from neighboring towns after hearing about the restoration. Many carried additional photographs, journals, and family letters they had only recently discovered in attics or storage boxes. Olivia accepted digital copies for the growing archive while carefully returning every original to its owners. The collection continued expanding exactly as Elijah had hoped, not through ownership, but through shared trust. Late in the day, the mayor thanked every volunteer whose efforts had restored the workshop. Jack, Eleanor, Tom, local carpenters, students, fishermen, librarians, and dozens of families received warm applause. Finally, the mayor turned toward Olivia. "1 year ago," he said, "this building was an abandoned tax property that most of us had stopped seeing. Today it belongs once again to the people whose lives it helped shape. That happened because one person looked beyond its market value." The room applauded, but Olivia felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. She stepped forward only long enough to offer a few quiet words. "When I left Wall Street," she began, "I believed I was searching for a different career. I didn't realize I was searching for a different way to measure success." She looked around the workshop at the families gathered beneath the restored beams. "For years I evaluated investments by asking what they were worth. Elijah Rowe taught me a better question. He asked what they were for. This workshop wasn't built simply to produce boats. It existed to strengthen a community. Preserving it has reminded me that the greatest things we build are often the relationships that continue long after we're gone." Her words were followed not by loud celebration but by sincere, grateful applause. As evening approached, lanterns illuminated the workshop with a warm, golden glow. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows, while visitors slowly made their way home. Jack and Olivia stepped outside onto the old loading platform overlooking the harbor. The frozen water reflected the first stars of the evening. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Jack smiled. "Still think buying this place for $350 was a bad investment?" Olivia laughed softly. "Financially, any way you want to measure it.
She looked back through the windows, where children still lingered around the woodworking display while families studied Elijah's ledgers together. "It turned out to be the best investment I've ever made," she answered. "Not because of what it earned, but because of what it returned." Jack nodded quietly. He understood exactly what she meant.
Before locking the workshop for the night, Olivia walked one final time to the display case holding Elijah Rowe's complete master builder's blueprints. Resting beside them lay his last notebook. Opened to the closing page, visitors paused to read before leaving. Beneath the carefully preserved handwriting, a small plaque displayed the words that now welcomed everyone entering the workshop. A boat built with skill may cross the sea. A boat built with kindness will carry generations. Olivia smiled, turned off the final light, and quietly closed the old wooden door behind her. Knowing she had not left success behind when she walked away from Wall Street, she had simply found the place where success finally meant something worth preserving. As Olivia's journey comes to an end, perhaps the greatest blueprint she discovered was never drawn on parchment. It was the quiet understanding that a meaningful life is built the same way a great boat is, one careful choice at a time, with patience, integrity, and a willingness to serve others before yourself. Elijah Rowe left behind no fortune, no famous company, and no monument bearing his name. Yet his kindness carried families across generations long after the last boat left his workshop. Olivia believed success was measured by promotions, profits, and the size of an investment portfolio. But she learned that the richest legacy is the one that continues to lift people long after we're gone. Maybe that's the lesson waiting for all of us. The opportunities the world dismisses as worthless sometimes hide the greatest purpose we'll ever find. The lives we quietly improve may become our finest achievement. And in the end, what truly survives is not what we owned, but what we chose to build in the hearts of others.